My name is Christina Carter, and I'm going to be starting out this tutorial today. So we have three main goals for this mini tutorial. The first is to introduce qualitative methods, so what they are and what they are not, and when you might want to rely on them. The second of our goals is to familiarize you with some ways of going about collecting qualitative data. So we're going to be outlining how you should go about planning an interview. We'll touch on what kinds of interviews you could use, which kind you should use, and how to conduct it in a systematic way that will get you good data. And our third goal is to introduce a systematic approach to analyzing qualitative data. So we'll walk through specific examples of how to analyze interview data specifically, but the analysis principles that we discuss can be applied to qualitative data more generally. So what is qualitative data? I'm going to be saying the words qualitative data a whole lot during this talk. So I'd like to start out here to make sure that we're all on the same page about what kind of data we're talking about today. Qualitative data is non-numeric data. And qualitative data can be collected in multiple ways. It might be collected through focus groups, which involve talking to multiple people at one time. You could collect qualitative data through one-on-one interviews, which involve talking to a single person at a time. Or you could also collect qualitative data through observation. So that would often involve a data collector taking notes on things that she or he directly observe, as opposed to being told about them from someone else. So it can also be collected in other ways, for example, through comment boxes on surveys. And when you get qualitative data for analysis, it often takes the form of text. So it could be written comments, like comments to those survey questions. It could also be written comments that are data collector notes from interviews and focus groups, or comments written, like I said, directly from the operators along with survey data. It could also be textual documentation though. So for example, descriptions of the terrain where the test occurred, or perhaps maps of the area of the test location. It might also be audio and visual media. For example, you might have recordings of a test participant using a new system, or you might have screen captures of a system's operators using a new software. Qualitative data is often thought of as subjective and quantitative data as objective. But sometimes that is actually true. So for example, we might have a best books of the year list from a magazine like the New York Times. And for that list, multiple people have been involved in determining which books should be included and in classifying which books should be treated as what genre. So then once all those titles are written down, each of them are in their own category, and you have text data, which is qualitative data, but it's also subjective data. So it's subjective qualitative data. And it's subjective because it was generated through the personal feelings and opinions of the scorers. So in this case, this is qualitative data that is subjective. There's also lots of examples though of objective quantitative data. So for example, the miles per hour a vehicle is traveling at a given moment in time, that's quantitative data. But it is also objective data because no personal feelings or opinions go into what number is appearing on the odometer. So these are the common ways that we think about qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data as subjective and quantitative data as objective, but this isn't always the case. So qualitative data can also be objective. So for example, let's say I want to document where every member of this audience has gotten their driver's license, and I have all of you send me a photo of your driver's license. So don't worry, I'm not going to ask you for that, but let's say that I did. Once I have all of these pictures, I document a list that is a list of states of where all these driver's licenses are from. This is qualitative data because it's text data, but it's also objective data because your driver's license doesn't change as a result of your feelings about it or my feelings, right? Subjective data has nothing to do with our subjectivity, our feelings, or our opinions. But we can also have quantitative data that is subjective. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that kind of data. Many surveys that turn Likert scales, so a response from 5 to 7, into a score, a number, fall into this category. They're quantitative, but they're also subjective. So for example, I might use a system usability score or maybe the NASA TLX, and I can convert a rating scale from 5 to 7 or 0 to 20 into a continuous score from 0 to 100. So this is numeric data, so it's quantitative data, but the source of the data is still subjective because it's related to the opinions and feelings of the respondent, even though it's a number. So this mini tutorial is going to be focusing on the two top types of data. So qualitative data generally, both subjective and objective. Now, our running example is going to focus on interview data. which is subjective data that's qualitative. But much of what we're talking about, much of what we discuss in terms of the strategies that you should take in preparation and how you should analyze and interpret your data, that is applicable generally to qualitative data, whether it's subjective or objective. So in addition to the format difference between quantitative and qualitative data, there also might be different epistemologies involved in different kinds of methods. So this is a rendition of the circle of science that everyone is pretty familiar with. But what's often excluded from the circle is the epistemology. And that's really where we start. So we actually start out, whether or not we acknowledge it, with a high level philosophical conception of how you come to know something, how you come to a conclusion about the world. And that really guides the methods that you use, your data collection, and how you integrate new knowledge. Conducting qualitative research often involves planning for knowing through interpretation. So qualitative methods are useful when you're interested in identifying requirements or the desirable features, perhaps of a system, perhaps of a process. So it's also useful when you're interested in brainstorming fresh ideas, identifying problems or issues, exploring use cases or spaces. So maybe you're not sure how a system might be used or how a process is taken. Qualitative data can be very useful in those instances to use a qualitative method to collect qualitative data. It can also be useful to analyze complex dynamics. A well-designed qualitative study should include intentional planning. So a prior description of the methods and what preparation you're going to take ahead of time to enable these methods. A well-designed qualitative study should also include qualitative research questions that support emergence, so that allow new topics that might deviate from the original line of questioning to occur, so that you can account for new understandings that might arise during the research process or even during data collection. And then a well-designed qualitative study should also include a plan to check or otherwise assure veracity of both the data and the analysis, and when applicable, the integration of mixed methods. So that's when you use both quantitative and qualitative approach simultaneously or in collaboration with each other. Then to have a rigorous analysis of qualitative data, your approach needs to account for the human as a sensor. So because a human, if it's me or if it's you, an analyst is using their own subjectivity to conduct the analysis, there needs to be special efforts taken to control for researcher bias. And we want you as researchers, we want to be able to use our experience to inform the analysis, but we need to still account for bias, our own biases about what we think that the data should be showing us. So when you're the researcher, we can think of this as sensor calibration, because as the researcher, you're the sensor, you're the one taking in information, qualitative information, text information, and deriving meaning from it. So rigorous analysis of qualitative data also needs to include recursive analysis. So this is known as hermeneutics, and we'll discuss this further in our analysis section, but it means that more than likely you're going to need to analyze your data multiple times. So for example, if towards the end of your qualitative data analysis, you learn something new that changes your understanding of certain responses, you're going to need to go back and reconsider the meaning, what kind of meaning you derived from the early responses that you analyzed, and see whether you change your understanding because of the new information that you have. A rigorous analysis also needs to include checks on both the data to ensure its validity, but also on the analysis itself. And then lastly, a rigorous analysis needs to ensure that it does a good job of communicating results. So that should include a descriptive illustration of how the data were interpreted, as well as the meaning that has been derived from the findings. So it's not enough, and we'll talk about this in detail in our analysis section, but it's not enough to just tell your audience what you found. You also want to tell them how you went about finding that. So let's say that you've decided you're going to address some or all of your research questions using a qualitative approach. How do you start? So prior planning is key to rigorous qualitative research, and there are some steps that you need to complete ahead of any research program. So you'll need to consider what you want to learn and the resources that are available for your study. In doing this, you need to identify what are the points of inquiry and research questions that you have. You'll need to apply relevant theories about what factors you should be looking for to help you build your codebook. And your codebook is the way that you're going to analyze or code text responses later on. So we'll go into more detail on that throughout the tutorial. And then you'll also need to identify your target population and sample, and consider whether you want to stratify within that sample. You also need to decide how you're going to recruit your sample. And lastly, you'll need to determine which data collection strategies you're going to be using. So let's look at an example and go through each of these steps in greater detail. So consider a case study. So let's say that we're doing an evaluation of ProTrain4u's clinical chart training. So let's suppose ProTrain4u is a startup that designs and administers short professional training sessions, both in person and remotely. And our job as analysts is to assess the impact of their training. So ProTrain4u is currently developing a clinical chart data management course for medical providers. And clinical charts enable data capture and collaboration between doctors, physicians' assistants, nurses, clinical and clerical staff. So we know from studies of clinical environments, research that's already been done, that these four roles all access and manage the same information, but they might use it for different jobs to complete different functions that are related, but not quite the same. So as a result, it's very important to consider how clinical chart data is captured and managed to support all four job functions. Additionally, we know that patient privacy is both a legal and an ethical imperative in the clinical office setting. So ProTrain4u Chart Training covers all of these issues, and it's working with a local care clinic to test a beta version of this training for continued development. So the clinical staff receive the training free of charge in exchange for participating in follow-on feedback and development exercises, which include a qualitative interview. So here we actually have a YouTube video of an actual qualitative interview used in this environment. And this is the example we're going to be using throughout the rest of the tutorial. We're not going to show you the interview itself because it's actually pretty lengthy, but we include the link here in case you want to go and watch it. We do include some excerpts of this interview to show you examples of the process, and that will be presented a little bit later on. But we also have the link to the full interview if you want an example of good ways to conduct an interview. So the first step, right, our first step in planning is to identify our points of inquiry and research questions. So how do we go about doing that for this case example? So we'll need to start with a central question or two that cover a broad area of interest. So for our example, maybe we want to know how the ProTrain4u training helped medical providers to improve their work practices and deliver better patient care. So once we have our central question, we want to define up to 7 sub-questions that can be directly answered. So sub-questions are not a requirement, but they do help with giving you a direction to start from. So as a rule of thumb, your central question should be complex enough that you need a paragraph or 2 to answer it. So, and you might want to have more than one central question as well. But for each one, you should need about a paragraph or 2. So it should be a pretty complex question. But then sub-questions to the central question should be simpler and more specific, and they should be answerable with a sentence or 2. So here are some examples of sub-questions that we might develop for this central question about the ProTrain4u training. So having 3 to 5 sub-questions leaves room to expand and shift, so you can add or remove questions as you clarify your research goal, or even as you're collecting data. So once you have your research questions defined, the next step is to consider relevant theories about what factors might shape the topics that emerge during your data collection and influence how you analyze your data. So what kind of phenomena are you expecting to see or talk about? So for example, we know from previous research in cognitive psychology that people are more likely to learn things when they're able to apply it to knowledge that they already have. So we might want to ask in assessing this ProTrain4u training, we might want to ask our participants whether they found the material that they were given relatable or relevant to their existing work conditions. You do want to be open to discovering new or unexpected relationships. So it may be that topics come up in our interview that we don't have any previous insight into or any relevant theories that we think apply. That doesn't mean that we should ignore those topics. We want to be able to be open to those topics and recognize that we may need to combine or extend theories after the fact to explain our observations. So this is actually one of the great strengths of qualitative research, that it can often help you to discover new relationships that you didn't plan to investigate. But even though you want to keep yourself open to discovering new ideas that you haven't considered, you can use what you already know ahead of your data collection as a basis for early codebook drafting. So what are codes? Codes are how we're going to ultimately categorize and label our data once we've collected it. It's how we're going to organize our data. So considering what kinds of concepts might come up in our interviews and how we might categorize them ahead of time can help us to think more explicitly about our expectations and how we might adapt our line of questioning if the interview brings up topics that we weren't expecting or didn't consider. So now that we've considered what we're asking about, the third step is to figure out who we're asking. So we want to identify our target population and sample. So we'll need to think about, in identifying the target population, we'll need to think about who is the user, whose thoughts about our system or product matter to us. So that's the population that we want to sample from. So in our case example, ProTrain4u decides to work with a medical care clinic to test a beta version of their training, because this clinic is representative of the kind of facilities that usually employ their training services. So the medical professionals at this site make up our sample of the overall medical professional population. Then once we've identified our target population, we can consider whether we want to stratify within the study population so that we're asking the right people the right kinds of questions. So having a stratified sample means that we collect our data based on the structure of the population. For example, at the medical care clinic where we're assessing ProTrain4u's training, we may have a hierarchical structure where some individuals have more authority than others. So maybe doctors have more authority than nurses, who have more authority than clerical staff. We want to make sure that we're interviewing people at all levels of that hierarchy. So people with different roles are also taking our ProTrain4u courses. So doctors take our ProTrain4u courses, but so do clerical staff. So we want to ensure that we don't only talk to doctors or only talk to clerical staff, but that we talk to people from all the roles for which our training is relevant. In other instances, we might care about other demographic factors. So in some instances, you might care about gender, you might care about socioeconomics, age, or race. But your research question is really what needs to guide how you stratify your population. If there are social factors that impact how different groups of people interact with the system or program that you're assessing, then you want to learn about that so that you know where you can stratify. So once we've stratified, we want to then plan our recruitment, and we need to plan our recruitment according to what we've determined as our desired population and our desired stratification. So ahead of conducting an interview, you'll need to find ways to actually get to those people that you've identified as being a good representation of your population of interest. Who you collect data from influences the generalizability of your findings. So if we only talk to clerical staff about their impression of our training course, we won't necessarily be able to generalize our results to all medical staff. For instance, maybe doctors think very differently about our training than clerical staff do. So our recruiting plan also needs to mesh with our sampling strategy. So we've decided we want to sample from different levels of authority and different roles at the representative clinic. So that's purposive sampling. We're approaching sampling with representation of our overall population of medical care staff in mind. We have a targeted demographic, so we want to make sure that we're recruiting people from that demographic. But we also might have aspects of our sampling that are not purposive. So for example, we've been very purposeful in our selection of a clinic and the kinds of people we're going to talk to at that clinic. But when it comes to actually approaching people, we're just going to ask everyone who's taken our training whether we can interview them. And then we're going to meet with the first 10 people who agree to be interviewed. So this aspect of our sampling is actually based on convenience. And there's advantages, the convenient approach is very convenient. That's why it's called the convenience approach. But there's disadvantages to, just because it's high in convenience, there's other issues, right? You might only find people who really loved your training, for example. Those might be the people who agreed to participate. So you could end up having some bias because of your sample and how you actually collected those people to collect data from. However, so it kind of depends on where you are, what approach you can use, what works best in your setting. Oftentimes, convenience is what we end up using in applied settings because that's what works best. We can't just select a random subpopulation, but sometimes we can. And so it's good to keep in mind your specific circumstances and what approaches you can maximize and get the most advantages from. So once we know who we want to talk to and how we're going to get them to talk to us, then we'll need to determine our data collection strategy. So specifically by building an interview guide. So to do this, we want to use our research questions along with our understanding of the population structure to identify discussion topics and develop specific questions for each topic. So our final questions, we want those to be open-ended and we want to avoid leading participants to a specific response. So our questions need to be crafted to coax a rich response rather than yes or no answers. So developing an interview guide is important because having a specific plan of what interview questions you want to ask documented ahead of time will help ensure that our research question gets addressed. For example, let's say that we want to transform our general research question about how our ProTrain4u course helped improve awareness, work practices, and patient care. We want to transform that into discussion topics that we can have a conversation with someone about. How do we go about doing this? First, we already have our individual sub-questions, right? And those all connect to our central research question. We've already developed those. But then we also need concrete, specific human level interview questions that we can use to spark a conversation with our interview participants. So we want to develop simpler conversational questions that can guide our interpersonal interaction with a participant. We want to translate our research questions that might be scientific or technical or have a lot of jargon in them. We want to translate those into human questions that an average person in our population can relate to. So we might start out our actual interview process with a little introduction, something like, so I would like to get to know your overall reaction to our training. What was your overall reaction? And then we might move to specific questions like, what was your general impression of the training? So notice that this question directly maps to two of the sub-questions of our research questions. So we want specific questions that map to our sub-questions of our research question, which get at our central research question. So we want to develop these specific conversational questions in a way that is open-ended. No yes or no questions, and no questions that are leading. We want neutral questions that don't lead or point the participant to a specific answer and that relate back to the research question that we're trying to answer, that capture some aspect of the central research questions that we have in mind. So here are some more examples of how we might derive specific interview questions for our interview guide and how they relate back to aspects of our original research question. So notice that these questions don't ask, for instance, the first question, what is your general impression of the training? This doesn't ask, did you like the training? Or did the training help you learn about privacy issues? Because if we ask, did you like the training? Someone might just answer yes or no. And we want a more nuanced response than that. We want more elaboration, not less. And if we ask, did this training help you improve your privacy procedures? Then we're leading participants to a specific topic, and we want to avoid doing that. Remember that the goal is to have a foundation of interview questions that will help you address your research questions from different relevant angles. So the idea is not that these are the only questions that you can ask and you can't diverge from these preset questions. In fact, we're going to talk about in a couple slides about how we don't recommend at all that you just stick to exactly these questions that you develop. We want you to be able to have new questions based and follow the flow of conversation, right? Go where the participant is leading you. But an interview guide gives you a good foundation for answering your research questions, and it can give you ideas for how to more easily pivot should the conversation need to go in a new direction. So the goal is really to generate a discussion that's going to help you address your research question from different relevant angles. Okay, now I'm going to pass it on to Dan Hellman.
Hi, everyone. This is Dan. I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick walkthrough on conducting interviews and the interview method as a qualitative research approach. As Christina mentioned, we have a YouTube video that presents a qualitative interview that we've based a lot of our examples on, and that's been posted in the slide deck and also in the chat. So if you want to visit that after the fact and kind of look back at some of the timestamps and get something out of the actual full video experience, it might be helpful. So to start this off, first thing you need to do is choose how to conduct your interview based upon your research goals. There are three basic interview approaches that vary in their organization and flexibility. First is the unstructured interview, which is the most flexible approach, but is also the least organized. It's conducted without any structure or direction in mind and is 100% extemporaneous. This is part of the reason that it's so difficult to conduct. It also doesn't necessarily assure that you will get feedback that's relevant to your central research questions. So the pros are that it's capable of uncovering veiled phenomena. You definitely might uncover something that's really interesting and never would have been imagined. But the cons are that it requires tremendous skill and is time intensive. It also does not guarantee that you will get useful data. At the other end of the extreme is a structured interview. which is the most organized interview approach, but also the least flexible. It's very similar to a written survey. Actually, it's sometimes referred to as an oral or verbal survey, depending on the field that you come from. The pros are that it can be quick to administer and produces regimented data and requires minimal skill on the part of the interviewer. The cons are that it doesn't really do much more than a written survey would. Really, you might get a little face-to-face interaction in addition to your answers, but that's about it. You really could just go with a written survey and get mostly the same results. A hybrid of the two approaches is called the semi-structured interview, and this is the most flexible and recommended approach to a rigorous scientific qualitative interview. It uses a structured set of discussion topics or themes, but allows the interviewer and participant the opportunity to shape what is discussed around those themes. This is an important facet of qualitative research called emergence, and it allows you to help to capture data about topics that you weren't really aware of when you began the research project. The interview guide, which was previously mentioned, is a tool which the interviewer and participant use together. What it really is it outlines the research topics that you want to discuss with the interview subject and some of the, I guess, the timelines and sort of the agenda for how you want to discuss things. It's a very useful tool for staying organized as you move through the interview. Now, the semi-structured interview from a pro standpoint is that it enables a broad spectrum of feedback detail and assures at least some useful data from every single interview. Skilled interviewers can uncover hidden phenomena just as well as in an unstructured interview. So it has all the benefits and very few of the weaknesses of either an unstructured interview or a structured interview. Next slide, please. Okay, so to successfully conduct an interview, consider the interview approach you'll take and plan for it ahead of time. As the researcher, you are the censor. You're the one capturing the information, so how you decide to document it is really important. Actually recording the interview, meaning video and audio, is always the best option, but it's not always possible. If you have the participants' consent and the setting that you're studying allows audio and video capture, then absolutely go for it. But you might have to think about some workarounds if you're in certain types of classified environments. At a minimum, you should take very thorough notes, but remember that taking notes involves some interpretation and generalizing on your part. So be aware of that as you work through and analyze your findings. The moment you took notes, you may be imparting some bias. So just be very careful and cognizant and self-aware of what you were thinking when you took the notes. Next, the interview guide, and especially the time you budget for breaking ice and rapport building, is very important. You want to approach the interview professionally, consider how you present yourself. You should dress in a way that will make you approachable and taken seriously. Think about where you will be conducting the interviews. Whenever possible, you want to ensure it's a comfortable environment that will be conducive to an open conversation with the participant. You may need to do some preliminary setup. The ProTrain4u example that we use later in this presentation illustrates how some of these discussions can become a little sensitive. So to build on the rapport that you establish at the outset, take some steps to assure trust and confidentiality by conducting the interview in an appropriate setting. With the telecons becoming increasingly common, you may be conducting interviews over Zoom or something similar. So you'll also need to keep in mind that participants may be in an office setting, or you may be in an office setting that can influence how they may respond to your questions. So just keep that in mind, and whenever possible, always make sure that you're using an environment that promotes confidentiality, privacy, etc., so that the participant feels comfortable disclosing information appropriately. When you start the interview, you should include some icebreakers or warm-up questions. And you should also consider sharing your interview guide with the participant ahead of time. What this really does is gives the participant an opportunity to kind of look through the questions that you're interested in, organize their thoughts, and it helps them to become a better partner in helping you to understand their experience, their opinions, what they're seeing about the research topic of interest. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about what it takes to run an interview. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the interview guide, but we also want to emphasize that running an interview takes more than just having an interview guide and a set of questions and best practices. Being a good interviewer takes a lot of training and practice. We actually recommend that you observe an interview 3 or 4 times at least before conducting interviews on your own. A little bit of practice will go a long way. So go ahead and use those opportunities to train yourself and get comfortable with the interview method as an approach to collecting qualitative data. We realize in some instances this can be hard to achieve, so we want to give you some tips and strategies to help you rely on, even if you can't get the observation and practice in. So what are some key points for conducting an effective interview? Remember, an interview is really an interpersonal exchange. You should think about your role in the interview. You're basically kind of a novice, and what you want to do is approach your interview subject or your interview participant as an expert who's helping you to learn the level of expertise that perhaps they have. It's obviously they can't teach you everything they know in an hour or something like this, but you're there to learn from them and they are the expert. So you also want to show genuine interest, sympathy, and a desire to understand your participant's experience and viewpoint. You should let the participant drive the focus about 75% of the time. So what that means is when you share your interview guide with them, let them kind of pick and choose the topics to talk about first, or figure out how to spend the focus on each individual topic. That's going to allow them the opportunity to reinforce with you what they consider to be the most important aspects of what you want to learn. As you interview the interview participant, you should look for inconsistencies in their story and then probe that topic. These inconsistencies are called breakdowns, and they're often a key indicator that there's something that needs to be clarified or explored. This is one of the key places you're going to find really great findings in qualitative research, is at the breakdown. So look for the breakdown. Finally, if you're having a hard time getting a conversation going with your participant and they don't seem to be particularly open to sharing, start asking for some stories or examples. That usually gets the conversational juices flowing and can help you capture some data from a tough customer. Another easy approach to get a kind of quiet participant to open up a little more is to ask them who might disagree with their viewpoint. The discussion of conflicting viewpoints often will tell you a great deal about what someone really thinks about a given topic. So that's another little trick you can use. Finally, you want to periodically throughout the interview recap or summarize what the participant told you in your own words. This offers them an opportunity to tell you whether or not you are understanding what they meant for you to understand. So to recap, want to build and maintain a good conversational relationship, be reflexive and open to new ideas, show empathy. Third, you want to let the participant drive the show to a great degree. Let them tell you what is most important to know. Always have a small bag of tricks to kind of keep the conversation going. And finally, revisit and summarize what you heard so that you know you're hearing them correctly. Next slide. All right, now that we've gone through the conceptual guidelines of how you should approach and conduct an interview, we're going to use the ProTrain4u clinical chart training case to walk through an example actually collecting data through conducting an interview and how you would analyze the data once you've collected it. Next slide. So there's some common steps for all scientific interview research. Basically, We're going to run down through this quick because you'll be following through this in the example. You want to collect background information and design research questions, build an interview guide, decide on sampling methods and strategy, as well as recruiting strategy. All of those things Christina covered thus far. I'm going to discuss how you conduct an interview and the beginnings of the review and analyze process. And then finally, after you've analyzed some data, you want to summarize the data and synthesize findings. Next slide. Okay. Now we're going into each step in our list in greater detail. So for step 1, collect background information. What's the product we're interested in learning about? In our case example, we're conducting an interview to contribute to ProTrain4u's development of a clinical chart training. ProTrain4u's overall mission is to develop trainings that enable short format learning. They're interested in creating trainings that include an embedded understanding of the setting they're training in. So for example, you know that in the clinical setting, different roles use the same data in different ways. That's embedded into their training. The goal of this specific training is to improve patient privacy and reduce discrimination. So patient privacy and discrimination are going to be 2 key topics we need to pay close attention to throughout the analysis. Next slide. As Christina demonstrated, we've developed some research questions, 2 research questions with sub-questions that address our research interests. The first one that we're interested in is how good is the training from a presentation standpoint and how impactful is it? We have a series of questions that allow us to approximate that. And the second question is, was the content coverage sufficient and what kinds of content or topics should ProTrain4u consider developing? So when we talk about these research interests, we might translate the wording a little bit between the research questions and the interview questions. And it's important to be able to align all these things back to what your original goal was and what you wanted to learn. So these are the 2 things that we're really going after. Next slide. And the interview guide process, or the interview in general, has 3 basic phases. You got the introduction and rapport building. Then you get into the body of the interview where you do all the research questions and try to record responses. And then you have the closeout, which is also very important for maintaining rapport and trust and assuring that you can collect good data sets and stay in touch with your respondents. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to start with the intro and rapport building section. The first thing you want to do is introduce yourself and provide some background and contact info for yourself. This is going to be important because if the participant has any questions down the road, you want to be readily available to them. Then you want to tell them a little bit about what you're doing and why and how you will use their data. This is really important for transparency and to give them a warm and fuzzy about disclosing sensitive information to you. Finally, get to know them. Ask them a few things about where they worked, what their relationship to your research topic really is. Try to get to know what it is about them that you need to know as you begin to ask more questions. Next slide. Next, you want to design the interview body. Okay, this is where you're going to discuss or cover the research questions. Now we had 2 primary RQs with a handful of sub research questions underneath each one. We're going to lay those out in the interview guide, but what we have to do, as Christina mentioned, is translate them into a approachable conversational type of question. So that's what we've done here. This is research question 1. How did ProTrain4u Chart training course help you improve awareness, work practices, and ultimately deliver better patient care? We lay out 5 questions that help approximate that. On the next slide, we'll see the second research question that gives us a second set of conversational interview questions. The big thing to notice here is that if this is your interview guide, at the interview questions, it says cover 5 questions by the 10-minute mark. What you really want to do is embed some reminders in your research or in your interview guide about timing and pace for getting these questions covered. 5, there's a total of 10 conversational questions. So in a 15-minute interview, if you've covered half of your interview questions at the 10-minute mark, you still have a few more minutes to get a few more questions in before you have to start closing things out. So think about the timing and budget and put some markers in there that help you work through the interview questions effectively. Next slide. So this is research question 2. Again, you'll see the rest of the conversational interview questions that relate back to the research questions. You want to lay all those out and give the interview respondent an opportunity to look through them and kind of pick and choose which ones they answer and the order they answer them in. Next slide. Okay, finally, this is the closeout. This is where you plan your exit strategy. What you want to do here basically is obviously first and foremost, thank the participant for their time. Ask them if they have any further questions for you. Always be open to them asking questions of you. If they have questions, give them answers. They may have some questions about what you intend to do with the data after they've discussed some more things. Then you want to advise them on the next steps. What are you going to be doing with their data? Offer them a copy of your notes for member checking. What member checking enables them to do is kind of correct your notes and correct you on the record about what they said. And that generally is across a couple different things about qualitative research that's helpful. That'll improve the quality of your research, the reliability, the veracity, all of those things. Next slide. Okay, so now in step 3 of the overall research process, we have to decide on sampling needs and design a recruiting strategy. As Christina mentioned, we are testing a beta training program with a captive audience. So we're in kind of a gray area about purposive sampling and convenience sampling, but in general, it's probably a convenience sample because participation in the beta training was voluntary, and then whoever responds after that continues to be voluntary. So you're kind of taking what you can get. It is a little purposive in the sense that you went directly to a clinic, which is a key end user that you'd want to cater to. So, but just remember these things and work through the sampling strategies and the recruiting strategies. That's going to be very important for the rigor of your qualitative research. Next slide. Finally, we're going to do the interview. This is the interview body. So we're going to give you some examples from ProTrain4u. I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. You can read through the interview transcripts as I'm describing what's going on here, because I think we're running a little behind on time. Okay, we're conducting the interview. We're cooking with gas. We're ready to use these excerpts from the interview transcript to offer examples of different aspects of the qualitative interview. First up is the introduction and rapport building ritual. In the case of this interview, the example is a little lean. Some more details about how they intend to use the interview data might be nice, but that may have been covered much earlier in the data training test project. A little more focus on Shay's work history and background might have been good too. For instance, has she worked anywhere else other than this particular clinic? Overall, this is okay because the interview is pretty focused on topics and very short qualitative interview standards. It's only about 13 minutes and most interviews are 30 minutes to an hour and a half. Notice it only took 49 seconds to get through this phase of the interview. Next slide. All right. So about a minute and a half into the interview, we have basic example of the interview shifting the focus and progression of interview questions to pursue information about an interesting point. We expect to hear about how information is received and recorded in charts. In this case, it's less about the roles and how they use the information and more about the nurse as the first touch point for capturing an accurate picture the doctors and physicians' assistants can work with. Shay gets how important this is. She's describing some of the coping behaviors she used in the past versus how she deals with uncomfortable conversations after the training. Allison may be chasing an opportunity to shift the interview topic more aggressively in an emergent way, but this appears to be a better example of reflexivity. This is where the expected interview story didn't unfold as expected, but a perfectly acceptable alternative explanation did. Accept the situation and shift your own understanding and move on. Next slide. All right, so This is an example of a confidentiality topic. It's an important one in Shay's body language if you watch the video, and description of accidental violations seems a little gun shy. Allison prods a little with one of the token, "Can you tell me more?" And by 4:33, Shay starts spilling the beans big time. So this is a good example of how to kind of prod a respondent into disclosing more information. Next slide. All right. Shay is starting to drop a few manhole covers on her office mates. Her concerns are legitimate, though. Furthermore, this kind of information was expected and was unexpected and might prove to be useful as more interviews are conducted. The real point here is that qualitative research needs to be emergent or adaptive, new information that warrants following. In this case, Allison has captured a nugget about workplace design and some challenges the clinic workers face in implementing best practices. Next slide. Okay, finally, this is an example of the breakdown I was discussing. Previously, Shay had indicated that training increased her awareness and inspired workplace changes. But then she described a situation where training improved awareness and there were no changes that resulted. So Allison asked for further explanation. What you don't want to do here is assume an interrogator's tone, just politely point out you heard some conflicting information and ask for an explanation. At the end of the day, Shay meant that training improves awareness and inspires changes, but only to the degree that the clinic staff have the ability to make those changes. So that is what it is, and I'll go ahead and pass off the rest of the presentation to Emily. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. So definitely want to encourage everybody to access the link that Dan put in the chat to see the interview and to read through the transcripts on the slides to really understand the important points that Dan has been going through about how to conduct an interview successfully. So at this point, we are ready to move on to analysis. So you've conducted your interview, you've collected your data, and so once you have your data, then what do you do with it? So here we're going to cover some guidelines and examples of analyzing qualitative data that you can adopt in your own qualitative research. Next slide. So after step 4, which was conducting the interview, we want to move on to the 5th step in our overall interview research process. And this is to review and analyze the data. So in order to get started with analyzing qualitative data, we want to develop something called a code book, and this is something that Christina mentioned earlier on. And at first, we want to develop a basic code book across all interviews. So what are code books? Just to reiterate, I know Christina spoke about code specifically, but what is a code book? So code books are like a bank of concepts or tags that you can apply to parts of qualitative data during analysis. And the code book is the tool, the codes in the code book, they're the tool that you are going to be using during the analysis process and from which you will be drawing meaning from. So we'll walk through an example to make sure that this concept is more concrete. So code books have been mentioned earlier, and specifically you want to start to develop a draft of them even before you collect your data. So to start in our case, some codes in our code book will be role-related tags. In the training that we're discussing, there are going to be role tags like nurse and doctor that are codes that you can put in your code book even before you start interviews, because you know these are the kinds of people that you will be talking to. You also know that other codes might be relevant before starting your interviews, things like patient confidentiality. So once you're done collecting data and are ready to analyze your data, that's when you're going to use this code book. So the codes that you add to your code book can have varying levels of detail, but they often they're often a category or ordered category that you should have a description or definition of what they mean. You can solidify the definitions or descriptions of your codes as you develop them, and it often helps to use snippets of the data where you think those codes are relevant and to give others an example of what your code means. So what does this look like? So on this slide here, we're going to turn to a more concrete example showing what a codebook could look like for our interview example in question. So like I just mentioned, as part of the process of creating a codebook is documenting the codes and their definitions. And so that's what we see here. The codes themselves are in the left column, and then the definitions are in the right. And this is something that you'll want to do as you develop your codes. Here you see codes in white, and then also a few highlighted in yellow. So some anticipated concepts were added at the beginning of the project based on design features in the training and the goals of your analysis. And so those are in white. These are the things that we've been discussing, things like the roles that you know, the kinds of people that you'll be talking to, like a doctor or a nurse. And you created these codes early in your research design process. Then after the training, we are further adapting our codebook during initial readings of the interview transcripts and adding new codes, which have been highlighted here in yellow. So for example, we've added a new role as janitor and a new concept called business process. And so what we want to emphasize here is that a codebook is adaptive and should adapt with your analysis of qualitative data. You're coming to the table ready for analysis with your codebook with already some pre-established codes, some things you already know that are going to emerge from the data. But as you learn your data, as you read through your transcripts, you will also add new codes as you go through this analysis process and adapt to the process as you learn more through reading your data. Next slide. So once we have our codebook, the next part of analyzing our data is to organize our interview transcripts into strips. So what are strips? Strips are subsets of qualitative data with a coherent topic. So they might be a paragraph or text of a couple of sentences. It's really up to the researcher conducting the interviews and during the analysis process to decide what size strip is appropriate for the research goals. However, a rule of thumb is that a strip should be a contained topic or a train of participants' thought, for example. And we'll show in a couple of slides what a potential strip could look like. So once we have the data organized into these strips, we can use our codebook to now start analyzing the strips with the goal of identifying what high-level themes are common across the data. So in other words, an initial pass through your data where you start applying your codes to sort of see what's going on in your data and how things are moving through your analysis. So here we've graphically depicted the frequency of some codes we've identified for a subset of our interview responses. So in other words, we've gone through an initial coding of our data, and we've coded a subset of our interview transcript, and these codes are turning out to be the most frequent, the ones in this broken up pie chart. And for this simplistic initial analysis, we can conclude that our example interviews seem to focus on information behaviors, patient privacy, and aspects of how the training design promotes learning. Next slide. So coding strips is not a one and done step. So something that Christina mentioned earlier on is that part of the process of analyzing qualitative data and coding qualitative data is to do so recursively. So we've had a first pass at coding our strips. We're starting to get a little bit of a handle on what things are emerging in our data, just with a basic frequency count of what codes are most frequent. But we'll want to review and analyze each strip again and consider whether we still agree with our initial code, or as you're going through this process in light of other strips we've coded, we might want to change a code to one we think fits better, or perhaps update a definition of a code, or even create a new one. So this is known as the hermeneutic process. We analyze our qualitative data, and then we analyze it again, and we repeat this process until we're confident in the meaning we've uncovered in our data. So it's iterative and recursive, and we might not settle on a final coding for a strip, either one strip, multiple strips, all of the data that we have, until after several reviews of our data. So analyzing qualitative data requires you to do so in a way that you're going through your data multiple times in order to find meaning and emerging themes. So let's start looking at an example to see how this process could unfold. So we want to tie codes, the codes that we've created, to entire strips, but we also want to code specific words and phrases within a strip. So consider this breakdown example from the interview transcript. The clarification following the interview's question, which is shaded in gray at the top, offers a good example of text we can break into a strip. So the strips are the question and then the answer. Each of these acts as a strip. And the participant's response is a strip, and that's black, the black chunk in the middle, and we can code this using our codebook. So here we've tagged a few points in the transcript that highlight existing themes or concepts that exist in our codebook. So for example, coding any roles as patient or doctor or PA. So as your participant starts talking about roles, we might want to, we should mark any of mentions of these roles in our data with these specific role codes that we have. And this is the same for concepts that we have in our codebook as well, things like patient privacy and patient discrimination. So we came to the analysis table with these codes already in hand. These were ones that we already knew we were going to use in our analysis, and we start coding our data and applying these codes. However, as you can imagine, there's a lot to unpack in a strip, even just a potentially relatively short strip such as this. And only one, there's quite a bit to unpack. And so we probably don't want to stop at this point, right? As I've said earlier, as we've mentioned throughout the process, analyzing this kind of data is recursive. And so the interviewee is probably trying to narrate something beyond just specific roles. And so we want to think of this when we're analyzing our data and then go back and recursively go through and potentially either apply new codes, create new codes as you go through the process. Okay, next slide. So in reading Shay's explanation of the situation, her response to the question asked, we can easily identify a few more relevant concepts that were originally not in our codebook. So these have been placed in blue callouts. So the red are the original codes that we had in our codebook, and the blue are new ones that we are using to signify a second round of code additions. So we're adapting to the process and we're adding new codes to our codebook. So these new codes highlight new concepts that we're interested in understanding more about in our interview analysis. And we've learned of these codes as we've iterated through our coding process. So maybe these new codes are coming about because we've read through the transcripts a number of times and these themes are now emerging through our analysis. So our new codes we've identified, the ones in blue, include intentional malice, facility limitations, and facility process harmonization. So let's walk through these. So front and center is the notion of intentional malice. So Shay's explained that when this situation occurs, meaning she's discussing jeopardizing patient confidentiality, we learned that it's not because the clinic staff don't care about patient confidentiality. It's actually the opposite. And so we mark this part of the strip with our new code that we've come up with as intentional malice. As we keep analyzing the strip, we see that it is because the limitations of the workspace that create difficult challenges to serving all of their patients efficiently that are causing some problems. So that seems important. And so even though it's not a topic we thought of before as we were going through analyzing our data, we want to make sure that we develop a new code and capture it and adapt to our data as we're learning new things. So this new code is facility limitations. Shay also highlights that they know they need help first with better facilities, but also with the practice of taking conversations about patients to a reserved and discrete location dedicated for the purpose. And so this is providing us with additional new information and new insights about facilities that the staff need access to. And so we provide this new code, facility process harmonization, to this part of the interview. And so to review for this strip, we've added the codes facility limitations, intentional malice, and facility process harmonization to our codebook that we didn't originally have when we came to the table for analysis. But as we iterated through the analysis process, these themes have emerged, and so we've adapted our codebook to include them. So we're going to follow this process of reviewing and coding each strip in this detailed way until we've gone through all of the data. And again, this process, as I've said many times, is recursive. So maybe this is the 10th strip we've coded, and we develop these new codes of facility limitations, intentional malice, and facility process harmonization. And so if that's the case, we're going to want to go back to the strips we've already coded to see if these new codes can fit in anywhere. Sometimes if you're not looking for something, you don't find it. So we want to make sure when we identify a new theme, we go back and re-examine our previous work to see if we find something new. Okay, next slide. So once you've gone through this process of coding your data, we then move in onto step 6 in our process, which is summarizing and synthesizing your coded data. So in our example we've just given, it's a simple example of coding a single strip from a single interview. But imagine doing this process across multiple interviews and multiple strips. So once you've coded all of the content of all of your strips, of all of your interviews, and you feel that you've iterated through the process enough, you move to this final step, which is summarizing the data and synthesizing findings based on the strength of explanation across your data. So there are multiple ways you can summarize your data. We might do some descriptive analysis to determine the frequency with which each topic came up across interviews. This is something I also presented a little earlier about frequency of codes. We can do this simply by counting up the number of times our codes appear in the overall data. Here, we're not necessarily interested in the specific number of times a code shows up, but more of the relative emphasis of each topic in the area. So we don't necessarily care that a code shows up 5 times, but in relative to the other codes, we see that potentially this code has more emphasis. Okay, next slide. And so there are a number of ways one could summarize and synthesize data. One is frequency-based, but another option might be summarizing data through what's called a thematic analysis. And this is organizing codes into themes. So for example, we might code our data in individual labels of different roles, but then group these under a single large roles theme or umbrella term or group related concepts like patient privacy and patient discrimination. Patient privacy and patient discrimination might be under a common theme of outcomes, for example. So there are multiple ways that one could analyze their codes. Next slide. So summarizing your data can help you start to think about it in an orderly way so that you can begin to synthesize your data and draw conclusions from it. So you summarized it and now you're trying to synthesize it. Ultimately, what you want to do is tell a story about what you found from your data. And a good way to start to do that is describing relationships between themes in your data. So in our ProTrain4u case example, we can see that the existing conditions of the clinic, the roles employees are in, and the facilities that are available to them are leading to processes that are impacting their outcomes like patient privacy. Next slide. As part of our synthesis process, one good rule of thumb is to depict the relationships we find graphically. And it's also, along with the graphic, it's helpful to use quotes from our data to illustrate the relationships that we've uncovered. So for instance, we could share a quote from Shay here that highlights how changes in facilities are needed to help ensure patient privacy. This part of your analysis is also recursive. You'll likely need to examine your data repeatedly to ensure that you're capturing the important takeaways from your data. When your repeated analysis keeps leading to the same findings, so how do you know when you're finished, is when you keep finding the same findings and the same conclusions. And when you achieve this, this is called saturation. And once you've hit that, you feel like you've saturated your analysis, you can move on to your final synthesis. So what does a final synthesis look like? For our final takeaway, you need to go back to your original research question and use the relationships you found between relevant themes to answer your question. So our first research question in the ProTrain4u example was whether the clinical chart training helped improve awareness, work practices, and ultimately deliver better patient care. So here's an example of how we might summarize our findings from the data. And just due to time, I'm not going to read the paragraph here, but this is one particular way that you move through the process of identifying different themes in your data, graphically depicting it with quotes, and then providing a summary in the form of a paragraph or maybe a couple of paragraphs based on what you've found. So to accompany the narrative summary as well, you can additionally add this graphic depiction with a one-sentence takeaway that shows the main message we want readers to take from this block of text. So from our interview analysis that we've done, we've identified this, this is our outcome that we're coming to, and we're coming to a conclusion that the training done enables medical staff to identify new factors that influence patient outcomes. So maybe not having proper facilities to discuss important patient information. Okay, next slide. So the last part of step 6 is, after summarizing and synthesis, is reporting your findings. So a key goal of a qualitative study, just like a quantitative one, is to be able to report the so what of the data you have. So with qualitative data, reporting findings through storytelling can help achieve this. So qualitative results should be communicated through illustration, and telling the story of the data is key. So we want to show the reader what we notice with quotes and pictures and diagrams, similar to what were in the past couple of slides, whenever possible. And we also want to demonstrate the logical path and reasoning that we took during our analysis. So if it helps, think about how Sherlock Holmes explains his process of discovery to Watson at the end of every investigation. You want to include descriptions of particularly salient data points you noticed and how those influence your reasoning and conclusions. It's likely to be wordy. Qualitative data is wordy, so it's likely to be wordy, but this is necessary for rigor. You want to walk through how you came to derive the meaning that you did from your data, so your reader can judge the strength of your explanation. In quantitative research, we have things like confidence intervals, effect sizes, and statistical significance as indicators of how good conclusions are. But with qualitative data, we have different things, and you have to describe your process to your audience so that your audience can gauge how much they agree with your conclusions based on your approach. That's a really key point in order to ensure that you have a rigorous analysis for qualitative data. And part of this is storytelling, and storytelling gives the audience the opportunity to see the key data features that led to your conclusion. So it helps build consensus between you and the audience on the meaning that you've discovered. And of course, depending on your audience, you might need a shorter summary, a longer summary, one that doesn't include all the details perhaps and looks more like just a single paragraph or a couple of paragraphs and one picture synthesis. It's up to the researcher to judge who their audience is, and that should, along with their process, guide how they're presenting their data and reporting it. Okay, so with that said, we have covered quite a bit, and that concludes the 6-step qualitative data process. And so now we'll move on to some conclusions and then to go over some broad points and then move to any questions or concerns that people might have. Okay, so for qualitative research efforts, we want to apply a systematic approach, and we've walked through that approach here today. Qualitative projects usually use interpretation of text data as their way of knowing about processes. And just like with a quantitative project, proper preparation is key to success. With qualitative methods, you need to be prepared to pivot or shift in the process as appropriate. Qualitative data are also often collected through interaction of humans. And as part of this effort, you need to build and use an interview guide and make sure you follow the steps that Dan laid out as formal questions, moving into your questions, allowing the participant to see the questions beforehand, in an effort to build rapport so that you can collect the most appropriate data as you can for your research questions. You want to follow a recursive iterative process when analyzing qualitative data. You come to the table with your codebook, and your codebook is updated and changed as you iteratively go through the analysis process. And this is key for analyzing qualitative data. It is a recursive process until you reach saturation. And then you synthesize your findings by showing relationships. And lastly, remember that communicating qualitative findings is a storytelling exercise. You want to show the systematic relationships you found in the data and often use examples and graphics in the best way to illustrate the patterns that you've found. Remember that when you have the chance to do so, tell your story like Sherlock Holmes, bring it to life in some way. So bring the reader into your process of analysis and show them how you reached the conclusions that you did, so that they can be convinced of the conclusions along with you, and so that your qualitative analysis is also rigorous. And with that, we are going to open the floor to any questions or comments that we haven't had a chance to address, or any sort of concerns that people might have.
Thanks, guys, for that mini tutorial. As Emily said, we have some time for Q&A. When thinking about, like, testing of our weapon systems and data collection, should we basically always be planning to build interviews into those tests and scheduling time for that? I know we're doing surveys, but I don't often think about doing interviews, but maybe I should.
So Rebecca, I think that it really depends on what your goal is. So in T&E, oftentimes qualitative methods could be very useful for two different types of areas. So one is maybe you don't actually know what exactly you want to test or learn about. So maybe maybe you're early in a test and you're not sure exactly where problems might arise, what actually about the system you want to look at in terms of a survey. So qualitative methods can be really helpful there to try to narrow down and define the problem space. But then also qualitative methods can be really good for getting you additional information from in addition to a survey that gives you more nuance, more detailed response than what you would get from a survey. So I think it kind of depends on the context, whether you want an interview or focus group at the end of your test. But I think that the main takeaway is if you're going to do one, it should involve quite a bit of preparation a priori. So you do want to actually go through those steps of preparing ahead of time. And then you also want to make sure that you have the time for a robust analysis on the end, because you don't want to spend all that time planning and collecting that data, but then not actually use that data in a way that's defensible once you have it.
Thanks.
And Dan, feel free to add, or Emily.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that Christina just said. The big thing I would add to that would be that if you're going to use a qualitative component to test and evaluation, just give some thought to how you intend to use the output from that. Sometimes you see a qualitative component used and the results aren't really built into the rest of the test plan. So it's a really good idea to think about what you want to use the output for, and then integrate it at an appropriate point in the test plan. It may be at the end of the test plan as part of kind of a debrief. That's certainly possible, but it could be at the front end of the test plan in order to capture some information about that will help you inform how to shape the test or what you need to test for. Qualitative methods can be very useful for that. Another place where qualitative methods could be very useful is identifying how users maybe have an unorthodox use or a kind of off prescription use for technology. So that's another place where you can use qualitative methods to understand how your end users are using the technology for a different purpose, or how they might work around problems with the technology.
Emily, I'm not sure if you saw the one question in the chat around the timestamp 210. It says, do you have any advice on how to avoid any pitfalls you've encountered when trying to apply these types of numerical methods? And maybe that's in reference to Dan, your answer.
The one thing I have seen, not necessarily in test and evaluation, thus far, but in some of the examples that I've seen where like machine learning approaches or some type of text mining or something like this is being used or compared against the qualitative reading and qualitative analysis approach, one of the things that usually shakes out is there's some nuanced and potentially significant differences in what they determine to be meaning in the data. And so if I was going to avoid pitfalls, what I would do is start comparing the results a little bit earlier, so that if you see some significant differences in what the two different methods are producing, you can try and reconcile what's going on. Qualitative methods are very malleable. You want to follow the best practices, but sometimes maybe the machine is going to notice things that you need to reconsider the human interpretation of, and vice versa. So I think comparing the results early would be the recommendation I would make there.
Yeah, and to add to what Dan is saying with that, I think depending on what kind of data you're dealing with, people who analyze, say, oral histories or transcripts of things, that you're just inundated with a ton of data, and manually reading through things is just too crazy. These sort of text mining and clustering analyses are really appropriate there. But to a lot of what Dan is saying is that humans are really the ground truth in terms of understanding language and making connections between things, and coupled with a subject matter expert really beats any machine learning technique, I think, thus far in terms of what's out there and what you can use. That's not to say they're not worth exploring or using. I think using them both together, especially if you have a lot of data, is a really good approach. But just knowing that humans are probably going to be able to make connections potentially that a computer can't. That's not to say a computer can't uncover things that you didn't think of, but humans are really the ground truth in terms of understanding and making connections in language.
Another thing I might add that Emily is probably maybe a little bit more in the know on is if you have an application maybe that involves translating between languages or interpreting cultural dynamics, some cross-cultural type analysis, you could very well have systems that are doing that right now, given this community, and putting a human into the analysis scheme there somehow is usually a good idea to make sure that you get the translation and the meaning right. And there's some more advanced approaches to doing that, but that's definitely something pretty important. Over.
Yeah, I think anything with translation, because things like metaphors are notoriously impossible for computers and any sort of machine learning to translate and get correct.
It looks like, so Michelle, I see you have your hand raised. If you want to unmute and ask your question, go for it.
Thank you. So in test and evaluation, we frequently have pools of participants based off of who is available to fly a plane. We only have certain pilots trained to do certain things, or certain operators trained to do certain things. And so we cannot, we only have those people. So is there value in trying to train them to see certain words with certain definitions ahead of time, so that we could try to standardize the type of responses that they're able to give? Or would that be tainting, I guess, the natural response? Because I think we're trying to get a combination of that, but I would like your thoughts on that.
I think how I would probably advise addressing the problem that you described is, as far as the qualitative researchers go, try to find somebody who has a little bit of a background, perhaps in aviation, and can talk a little bit more shop with the pilots. That's something that you will frequently see, with various projects. It's good if the interviewer kind of knows a little bit about the field and can let the interview subjects know, hey, you can talk shop with me, you can tell me things, you can use your lingo. I'll be able to understand what you're following. As far as kind of cluing some of the pilots in about some of the frameworks, maybe the theoretical frameworks that you're looking at studying, like perhaps if you want to look at how pilots are exchanging information when they're in the air. You might, clue them into some of the theories that you're working with. You could try and do that. I think a lot of your methods would stay the same. You might risk some bias because your pilots then are sort of, it's kind of like the same discussion as taking notes. Instead of recording audio and video, whatever they report to you then would have a little bit of bias kind of built into it because they've sort of generalized to their own experience and now they're translating it for you into your own language. So I wouldn't say it's impossible to do, but if you're gonna do that, make sure you do a pretty solid job of explaining that to them, and also definitely try to capture some type of impartial data that you can triangulate their responses with. That's always a good idea. If you have some system data that you can use to corroborate what they're telling you, that's always good to mix those things.
Chris had a question in the chat about acquiring interview training skills. So do you know of any training opportunities, besides this, I guess, like deeper opportunities for people in T&E to become better interviewers, or if there's any certifications that you know of? I know that, Chris, this is something that is an area that a lot of even test agencies are pursuing because they don't necessarily have the expertise that they would like. But Dan, I don't know if you know of any resources that we can recommend.
Yeah, I am not aware of like any type of formal certification to conduct interviews. It's possible there's something out there, for like a clinical psychologist or something like that, or perhaps even for like a, what would they be called? Not necessarily a doctor, but a counselor. There might be some certifications there that are useful because they put you through a similar training regimen in terms of how to have a qualitative scientific discussion, interview, conversation with somebody. Aside from that, my recommendation is just find some projects and find some people who have some experience doing this type of work and shadow them. And if you don't have that as a resource, get on YouTube. There's a lot of material on YouTube that you can use to help train yourself in some of these methods. And I know that's maybe not the most desirable answer, but shy of saying, shadow or take some sociology or psychology classes at a local university. I mean, that's probably the best I've got, if you're trying to do it, economically speaking.
There are also these sites, Coursera or edX, that also have, but potentially might have classes on how to conduct interviews, how to get better at interviews, how to collect that kind of data and analyze it. So I would also check that out, see if there's something. I'm not sure if there is, but there might be.
So Michelle, just in terms of whether courses on writing and administering surveys are a good start, there's some things that you can generalize between surveys and interviews. So for instance, you don't want to have leading questions for surveys. You also don't want to have leading questions for interviews. But in a lot of other ways, they're kind of unique tools because surveys, you really are trying to get at just one, you're really trying to isolate one idea and have that in one question and allow someone to give just one single response to that question. We really don't want to have anything that says like, what do you think of this and this in a survey? What do you think of this or this in a survey? Surveys are not open-ended and they shouldn't have open-ended questions unless they're comment boxes. Whereas it's the opposite for interviews. We want open-ended, we want a discussion, we want a response that's bigger than just one singular, something that can be just put into one singular number. So I would say that they're probably pretty different. I don't think that would necessarily relate. It might help you in some ways, but I think it wouldn't quite be good for teaching you about interviews. I don't know, Dan and Emily, feel free to disagree, but that's I think that's the case.
Yeah, I would completely agree. Just try to follow the best scientific practices. And as far as the actual trade craft of conducting an interview, sorry to say, a lot of it is just get in there and get some on the job training. That's really what you got to do. I think in graduate school, I took a course on qualitative methods that involved a section on the interview method, and quite literally, they just paired us up and we interviewed each other until we started getting good at it. So that's how I would recommend approaching it. It's the best way to learn is to just do it. Over.
Yeah, and so when Dan says just do it too, like you might want to do some of that practice, like maybe practice with a coworker or colleague before you're, practicing on your actual data collection, the people you actually need data from, and follow, Michelle, just following, I think, some of the guidelines that we outline here, thinking about your questions ahead of time, designing questions that are not binary, that are trying to get more general and not leading people in a specific direction. That will go a long way in helping you conduct better interviews. And having a plan outlined and running your questions past someone and asking, does this question push you in a certain direction, or do you feel comfortable? Would you feel like this question I was trying to get something specific out of you? Even that can be really helpful, just to have your own eyes on it ahead of time and have someone else's feedback on it and how they might respond to your questions would be helpful.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, one of the strengths about qualitative methods is that it's very flexible and adaptive. So if you interview a few people and you find that some questions aren't working, you can change or reword them and adapt to your environment. And so you're not as hamstrung to the kinds of things that you can do maybe as in quantitative methods. And so don't feel just because you've created your interview guide that those are the questions you need to state them as they're worded. If they're not working, you can adapt and change as you're going to still try and get the kinds of data that you need.